Carmine Moretti arrived at Pier 14 at 4 in the morning, 2 hours before the port authorities' shift change, and 3 hours before the first legitimate cargo manifest would be logged at the customs house on Atlantic Avenue. He came in a black Ford Expedition with no plates, flanked by 2 vehicles carrying 6 men total, all of them armed, none of them speaking. The pier jutted into Boston Harbor like a broken finger, lit by a single sodium lamp that threw orange light across the wet planking. A cold wind off the water carried brine and diesel and the distant groan of the Tobin Bridge. The man they were there to see was named Gus Ferrante. Gus ran a competing operation out of Chelsea, controlling 2 loading bays at Pier 14 through a network of dock foremen he paid in cash every Thursday morning. He had been skimming containers off the Eastern Manifest for 11 months, quietly siphoning product that moved through what Carmine's organization considered sovereign territory. The skimming had been small at first, almost invisible. Then it became a pattern. Then it became a declaration. Carmine's lead enforcer, a thick man named Salvatone, had confirmed the numbers 3 weeks ago. $83,000 in diverted cargo over 11 months. The financial loss was not the issue. Carmine had crossed $60 million in annual port revenue the prior year. The $83,000 was a rounding error. What it represented was the problem. Gus Ferrante was waiting at the far end of the pier, standing between 2 of his own men who both had their hands visible in the way men do when they want to appear non-threatening but cannot quite commit to it. Gus was around 50, broad across the shoulders with a salt and pepper beard he kept trimmed close. He wore a waterproof jacket over a collared shirt. He had been in the dock trade his entire adult life, and knew what a 4 a.m. meeting arranged by Carmine Moretti meant. Carmine stepped out of the expedition and walked toward him alone. He wore a dark overcoat and kept his hands in his pockets. He did not hurry. Sal and 2 others followed at a distance. Gus started speaking before Carmine reached him. He said he wanted to explain that there had been a misunderstanding with his foremen, that the numbers Carmine's people had weren't accurate. Carmine stopped walking. He studied Gus for a moment with the flat attention of a man reading a ledger. Then he said, quietly, that Gus's foreman had been found 3 days ago in the trunk of a Chrysler on Marginal Street, and that the foreman had given a very complete account of the arrangement before he was found. Gus stopped talking. What followed was not dramatic. Carmine produced a folded document from his coat pocket, a single type page, and handed it to Gus. The page listed the 11 months of diversions by date, container number, and approximate street value. At the bottom was a total. Gus read the page carefully. One of his men shifted his weight. Sal's hand moved slightly inside his jacket. Carmine told Gus that he had 2 choices. He could transfer the controlling interest in his Chelsea loading operations to a holding company that Carmine's attorney would establish by end of week, retaining a 20% managerial fee and walking away from the rest. Or he could decline and take the conversation to its natural conclusion right there on the pier. Gus looked at the page for a long time. The harbor moved behind him. A container ship was moving slowly through the outer channel, its lights making slow arcs in the low fog. Gus said he would sign the transfer. Carmine nodded once. He took the page back from Gus, folded it, returned it to his coat pocket. He turned and walked back to the expedition without another word. The entire exchange had taken less than 7 minutes. On the drive back toward the city, Sal mentioned that Gus had looked scared. Carmine said that was appropriate. Then he looked out the window at the highway and did not speak again for the remainder of the ride. This was how Carmine Moretti operated. Not with noise, not with spectacle, with documentation, timing, and the kind of certainty that comes from controlling every variable in the room. He had built the Boston syndicate over 2 years from a protection operation in the North End into a financial infrastructure that touched the port, 3 construction unions, 2 municipal parking authorities, and a commercial real estate holding company that managed 11 properties in Suffolk County. He did not take unnecessary risks. He did not make moves without complete information. He did not trust sentiment over structure. His organization had 4 primary layers. The outermost layer was legitimate business, the construction and real estate fronts that generated clean revenue and provided employment records for 37 individuals who appeared on no law enforcement registry. The second layer was the financial management operation, overseen by a CPA named Morton Hale, who had been with Carmine for 14 years, and who managed the flow between dirty and clean money with surgical precision. The third layer was operations, the dock network, the distribution arrangements, the protection agreements, all of it coordinated through a hierarchy of capos who each controlled a specific territory and reported to a single underboss. The fourth layer, the innermost, was Carmine himself, his son Leo, and a small council of 3 men who had been with him since the beginning. His underboss was Dante Ricci. Dante was 41 years old, the son of a revered trucking operator who had supplied fuel to the syndicate's early dock contracts. Dante had come up through the organization in his mid-20s, proving himself first as a driver, then as a coordinator on the chemical import routes that ran through the port of Boston's commercial container terminals. He was sharp, organized, and careful with money. He had his own network of relationships within the 5 families that operated across New England. Connections Carmine had encouraged him to develop because a good underboss needed political capital outside the immediate organization. Dante was loyal in the way that ambitious men are loyal when they believe their ambitions are being accommodated. Carmine understood this distinction but had not yet been given a concrete reason to act on it. Leo Moretti was 22. He had spent 2 years at Northeastern studying finance before Carmine pulled him into the organization, not for operational purposes, but to begin learning the financial architecture from the inside. Leo was not hardened. He lacked his father's stillness. He talked too much in rooms where silence was the more intelligent option, and he had a tendency to mistake goodwill for loyalty, which was a dangerous confusion in their world. Carmine was aware of these limitations and worked around them. He kept Leo out of operational decisions, shielded him from the parts of the business that could not be explained in a ledger, and told himself that the boy would develop judgment with time. He told himself this often enough that he had stopped questioning whether he believed it. The charity gala at Boston General Hospital was the 3rd Thursday in October. Carmine attended it every year. The hospital's cardiac wing had been partially funded through a donation from a construction company that Carmine controlled through 3 layers of ownership, which made the gala a reasonable place to maintain his cover as a legitimate businessperson. He brought Leo. He brought Sal and 2 other security personnel. He wore a dark suit and shook hands with a city councilman and a hospital administrator and 2 developers he knew through legitimate channels. And he stood near the east wall of the ballroom and watched the room with the same flat attention he gave every room he was in. The ballroom was large and well lit, filled with 200 people representing Boston's medical and business community. There was a string quartet. There were round tables with white linens and arranged flowers. There was a champagne service operated by 3 servers who moved between the tables and a central bar. Carmine accepted 1 glass early in the evening and did not take another. He watched who spoke to Leo. He tracked the movements of the room's staff. He noted the exit points. These habits had calcified in him over 2 decades to the point where he no longer made a conscious choice to perform them. Leo was at a table near the center of the room, speaking with 2 young professionals Carmine did not recognize, medical administrators in their early 30s. Leo was animated, leaning forward, laughing at something one of them had said. A server passed and Leo took a champagne glass from the tray without looking at it, took a drink, and continued his conversation. 40 minutes later, Leo stopped talking. He placed 1 hand flat on the table. The 2 people across from him looked at him with the sudden attention that indicates that something has changed in another person's face. Leo stood up too quickly, knocking his chair back, and grabbed the edge of the table. One of the other guests said something. Leo's legs gave. Carmine was already moving when Leo hit the floor. He crossed the ballroom in 12 seconds, arriving to find his son on his back. His body rigid, 1 hand pressed against his sternum. Leo's lips were losing color. A thin line of blood was tracking from his right nostril. Sal had his radio out. The 2 medical professionals at Leo's table were on their knees, and one of them had begun checking Leo's pulse. A woman in a gray wool blazer pushed through the gathering crowd and said loudly that she was a nurse and needed everyone back. She did not wait for people to comply. She went to one knee, checked Leo's eyes with a small penlight. She pulled from her jacket pocket and spoke in a clipped, direct voice to the medical professional beside her, asking what he had observed over the last 3 minutes. Carmine stood over his son and watched this woman work. She was in her early 30s, brown hair pulled back, no jewelry. She was not wearing event attire. She was wearing clothes she had arrived in, which meant she was a hospital employee, attending professionally rather than socially. She had the mechanical efficiency of someone who had performed emergency assessments in genuinely high stakes conditions and had no patience for anything that interfered with the task. The ballroom's chief security officer arrived and said they needed to clear the room. Sal stepped in front of him and told him that no one was moving until the boy was stable. The security officer began to object. Sal looked at him with the particular quality of attention that ended that kind of conversation. The nurse looked up from Leo and said the hemorrhaging pattern around the nasal passage, combined with the tonic muscle rigidity and the rate of color loss, was consistent with neurotoxic exposure. Not a heart event, not an allergic reaction. She said they needed specific chemical intervention, not a standard crash cart, and she said it to the two doctors who had pushed through from the hospital's medical staff. She named the counteragent protocol. One of the doctors hesitated, said the protocol was aggressive and off, label for field application. The nurse told him the window was approximately 4 minutes and asked if he wanted to wait for a committee vote. The doctor authorized the protocol. The nurse administered it herself, drawing from an emergency kit the hospital's medical director had brought. Leo convulsed once, then went still. His breathing, which had been shallow and arrhythmic, steadied into a shallow but consistent pattern. It took 11 minutes from the first collapse to stabilization. When it was over, the nurse sat back on her heels, looked at Leo's breathing, and then looked up at Carmine and said his son was going to need intensive monitoring for the next 12 hours, and that the toxin's specific profile suggested deliberate administration rather than accidental exposure. Carmine looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Sal. Then he looked at the champagne glass that was still on Leo's table, the one the server had placed in front of him less than an hour ago. His security detail had controlled the entire catering arrangement for the evening. They had verified the servers, the bar staff, the supply chain from the distributor to the venue. They had positioned 2 of their own people on the floor. The champagne that had reached Leo's table had passed through a process that only 4 people in Carmine's organization had managed directly. He did not say any of this out loud. He looked back at his son who was breathing, and then at the nurse who was watching him with an expression that was careful and unreadable. He told Sal to secure the hospital floor. He told his second man to get Leo to a room and not leave the doorway. Then he looked at the nurse and told her, with a finality that did not leave room for negotiation, that she was coming with them. Her name was Clara Voss. She had been working the emergency floor at Boston General for 6 years. She was 31 years old. She had roughly $42,000 in outstanding student loan debt, an additional $18,000 from a medical equipment loan she had taken for her mother, who had chronic kidney disease and required specialized home dialysis equipment. She rented a 1-bedroom apartment in Dorchester and drove a 2017 Civic with a cracked taillight. She worked extra shifts when they were available. She had called out sick twice in 6 years. Carmine did not learn all of this immediately. He learned enough in the first hour to understand that she was not a plant, not a professional, not a person who had been placed at that gala by anyone with intentions. She was exactly what she appeared to be, a hospital employee who had recognized a symptom set that most people would have missed, and had acted on it without considering whether the man on the floor was worth the risk. The Moretti compound was a 12-room house in Weston, 30 minutes west of the city, set on 3 acres behind a stone wall, and a camera system that Carmine's security coordinator updated annually. The house had a medical room on the 2nd floor, equipped for field treatment, which was a practical precaution that had been justified on 2 prior occasions. Leo was moved there from the hospital by private transport before dawn. Clara was placed in a guest room on the same floor. She was not restrained. She was told by Sal, speaking with the careful plainness that Carmine required of his people, that she was there to monitor Leo's recovery, that she would have everything she needed, and that she would be compensated generously for her time. She was also told, in the same tone, that she should not attempt to contact anyone or leave the property. Clara said she had a mother who needed care at home. Carmine, who was standing in the hallway outside Leo's room when she said this, told Sal to arrange for a private care service to cover Clara's mother starting that morning, at the organization's expense. Clara looked at him with a complicated expression. She did not thank him. She went into Leo's room and checked his vitals. Carmine went downstairs and sat in the study off the main entrance. He poured a glass of water and did not drink it. He went through the sequence of the previous evening twice, meticulously, from the moment they had arrived at the gala to the moment Leo fell. He had 4 people who had managed the champagne service arrangement style, who had personally vetted the catering company, Rizzo, who had positioned the floor security, Dante, who had coordinated the advance team that swept the venue 2 hours before the event, and Marco, Dante's second, who had handled the specific server assignments. Sal had been with Carmine for 16 years. Rizzo had been with him for 9. Dante had been with him for 11. Marco had been with him for 4. He did not reach a conclusion that night. He recorded the sequence in his mind with the same care. He gave to financial discrepancies, filed it in the category of incomplete information, and set it aside until he had more data. Acting on incomplete information was how men in his position made fatal errors. He had learned this the hard way, 20 years ago, in a situation he did not let himself think about with any regularity because the memory of it still had the capacity to break through the discipline he had spent 2 decades constructing. In the morning, Carmine told Sal to pull Dante's operational logs from the past 90 days. He did not explain why. He told Sal to be quiet about it. Sal asked no questions. Dante arrived at the compound by 9 that morning, expressing concern about Leo and offering to increase the perimeter security. He was composed. He asked appropriate questions about Leo's condition. He suggested that the poisoning might have originated with the rival Pellegrino faction out of Providence, which had been making noise about the northern port access agreements for 2 years. He was thorough in his expression of loyalty and thorough in his framing of the alternative theory. Carmine listened to all of it without interrupting. He thanked Dante for coming. He asked Dante about the advance team's access to the venue's beverage service, framing the question as a procedural review. Dante answered without visible hesitation, providing a timeline that was internally consistent and that placed the primary contamination window at the distributor level rather than the floor level. Then he left. After Dante's car had cleared the gate, Carmine sat with the timeline Dante had just given him and compared it against what Sal had confirmed about the floor arrangement. There was a gap of 22 minutes in Dante's account, a window between the completion of the sweep and the arrival of Carmine's floor personnel, during which the champagne service had been briefly unsupervised by anyone in Carmine's direct chain. That window was consistent with opportunity. It was not evidence, but it was a gap, and in Carmine's experience, gaps in intelligent men's accounts were rarely accidental. He told Sal to find the bodyguard who had been directly responsible for the champagne service on the floor that night, a man named Reyes who had been with the security detail for 2 years. He wanted Reyes brought in for a private conversation. By that afternoon, Leo was awake and sitting up. His color had returned. He was weak but coherent, asking questions about what had happened. Carmine sat with him for half an hour and told him only that there had been a medical incident and that it was being addressed. Leo asked if he was in danger. Carmine told him no, which was a lie, spoken with the same control he applied to everything else. Clara was in the room for most of this exchange, moving between monitoring Leo's vitals and making notes in the log she had created on a pad Sal had provided. She did not involve herself in the father-son conversation. When Carmine stood to leave, she caught his eye and gave him a small nod that said the patient's trajectory was positive. He acknowledged it and left. In the corridor, Carmine stood for a moment outside Leo's door. He was not a man who allowed himself to register fear as an emotion in real time. He processed it later at distance, in the controlled conditions of solitude. But standing in that corridor, aware of how close the margin had been, aware that the champagne had been poured by someone inside his operation, he felt something move through him that he recognized and did not name. He went back downstairs and got to work. The Rise situation resolved itself before Carmine could act on it. Sal found Reyes in the holding room in the compound's lower level at 6:15 in the evening. Reyes was dead. He had been dead for at least 4 hours, judging by temperature and the fixed presentation. The method was chemical. The toxicological profile, assessed by the retired forensic consultant Carmine kept on informal retainer, was consistent with the same compound class that had been administered to Leo, which meant that whoever had poisoned Leo had also identified Reyes as a link in the chain and eliminated him before Carmine could question him. This changed the calculation significantly. Poisoning Reyes required advanced knowledge that Carmine was planning to question him, which meant that whoever had killed Reyes knew about Carmine's internal investigation within hours of its commencement, which meant they had access to information about Carmine's intentions that could only come from inside the compound or from Sal. Carmine did not share this reasoning with anyone, including Sal. He went to the compound's camera system and reviewed the footage for the lower level going back 24 hours. The lower level camera had experienced a 12-minute dropout at 1:47 in the afternoon. The footage was there on either side of the gap, confirming the system was functioning, which meant the dropout was deliberate. He copied the footage onto a personal drive and deleted the record of the copy from the system's log. That night, he reviewed Dante's logs that Sal had pulled. The logs covered 90 days of operational records, meeting schedules, transaction authorizations, territory reports from the capos, and communication summaries. The logs were comprehensive in the way that documents produced by a careful man are comprehensive, which is to say they covered the correct categories and contained the expected level of detail without revealing anything that was not already known. There were no visible irregularities, which was, in its own way, informative. Carmine had seen unaltered records, and he had seen records that had been cleaned. Clean records had a specific quality, a smoothness at the edges, a consistency of framing that reflected preparation rather than occurrence. Dante's logs had that quality. He noted this and continued. 2 days after Leo's stabilization, Clara was in the main kitchen in the late morning, making coffee with the uncomfortable efficiency of someone navigating a space that is not theirs. Carmine came in, poured himself coffee from the same pot, and sat at the kitchen table. He asked her how Leo was doing. She told him Leo was progressing normally, that the residual neurotoxic effects would likely resolve completely within a week, and that he should avoid any strenuous activity until his neurological function was fully assessed. Then she looked at Carmine and said that she needed to go home. She said it plainly, without drama, the way a person states a fact rather than makes a request. Carmine said he understood that and asked her to give him a few more days. She asked him how many days. He said a week. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said that the medical care arrangement for her mother had been thorough and professional, and that she appreciated it, and that she also needed him to understand that whatever was happening in this house was not something she wanted any part of, and that once Leo was well enough to be monitored by a standard private nurse, she expected to be returned to her life without interference. Carmine said that was reasonable. She looked at him with a directness that he found, despite himself, slightly unusual. Most people who spoke to him in this house did not make eye contact for extended periods. She did. She asked him how long he had been living like this. He asked her what she meant by that. She said she meant the security, the isolation, the way everyone in the house moved around him like they were navigating a physics problem. She was not asking to be provocative. She was asking as someone who had spent the past 48 hours in an environment she did not understand and was attempting to understand it. He said a long time. She asked if it was worth it. He did not answer immediately. He drank his coffee. The question was not one that anyone in his world asked, because in his world the answer was assumed to be yes. That power and wealth were self-evidently worth what they cost. He had operated on that assumption for so long that it had become structural, like a load-bearing wall in a building. You did not question load-bearing walls. He told her that was a complicated question. She said that most honest questions were. Then she stood up, rinsed her cup in the sink, and went back upstairs to check on Leo. Carmine sat at the kitchen table for a few more minutes. He was thinking about his wife. He was not conscious of this at first. The thought came in sideways the way it always did. Elena had died in October 20 years ago. He had been 40. Leo had been 2. She had not been sick. She had not had an accident. She had been poisoned. A fast-acting hepatotoxin introduced through a contaminated water source in their home, specifically the kitchen sink, which was the only water source that was not connected to the reverse osmosis filter Carmine had installed after a contamination scare at a neighboring property the prior year. The filter had been disconnected 3 days before Elena died. Carmine had not noticed. The man responsible had been a rival, a figure named Corrado Fenn, who had been attempting to leverage control of the North End's restaurant protection operation. Carmine had dealt with Corrado Fenn within 2 weeks of Elena's death. He had done it personally and with complete finality. And then he had done something that he had never fully explained to himself or to anyone else. He had taken the grief and the guilt and the rage, and he had compressed it into something that fueled every subsequent decision. He had built the empire. He had built the security. He had built the hierarchy and the protocols and the walls and the camera systems and the vetted supply chains and the comprehensive procedures for every conceivable threat. He had done all of it ostensibly to protect Leo. And someone had poisoned Leo anyway, not from outside, from inside. He had not wept for Alina in 15 years. He did not weep now. But sitting at the kitchen table in the compound he had built as a monument to his capacity to prevent exactly this kind of thing, he felt the weight of the original failure with a clarity that was, in its own way, unbearable. He finished his coffee. He stood up. He put on his coat and went out to the perimeter to review the guard rotation. That same afternoon, in a private dining room above a seafood restaurant on Commercial Street, Dante Ricci was meeting with representatives of 3 of the 5 families. The meeting had been arranged through an intermediary and was conducted with the careful indirection that serious organizational conversations required. Dante did not make explicit proposals. He described conditions. He noted that Carmine's recent behavior had become erratic, that the investigation into the Leo incident had created internal paralysis, that several of the syndicate's operational pipelines were experiencing delays because Carmine was pulling resources into a paranoid internal audit rather than keeping the machine running. The representatives listened. They asked questions. The man from the Providence family, a heavyset lawyer named Bergamo who represented the Pellegrino interests, asked directly whether Dante was proposing to assume control of the Boston operation. Dante said he was proposing to stabilize an operation that was showing signs of structural weakness. The distinction was diplomatic rather than real. Bergamo said the Providence family would be supportive of organizational stability in Boston, provided the port access agreements remained consistent and the existing financial arrangements were honored. The other 2 representatives expressed similar positions in similar language. Dante thanked them for their time and left through the back of the restaurant. He sat in his car for a moment before his driver pulled out. He had been working toward this conversation for the better part of a year. The Leo incident had accelerated the timeline in ways that had not been planned but that were ultimately useful. Carmine's paranoia was real and it was increasing. His grip on the organization had never been more visible, which meant it had also never been more brittle. Men who squeezed harder when they felt threatened were men who eventually broke what they were holding. Dante was not particularly emotional about what was coming. He had a certain respect for Carmine, the professional kind that one skilled practitioner has for another. But respect was not loyalty, and the distinction mattered enormously when the math changed. He told his driver to take him to the port. At the compound, Carmine was going through Dante's financial records with Morton Hale. Morton was a small man in his 50s with the look of someone who had spent most of his adult life in rooms with bad lighting, which was largely accurate. He spread the records across the study table in the organized fashion of a man who thought in categories and moved between them efficiently. The records covered 2 years of operational flows. Morton had been asked to look specifically at the chemical import accounts, which were the division Dante supervised directly. What Morton found, after 4 hours of review, was not an obvious discrepancy. It was a pattern. 11 separate transactions over 18 months, each individually within normal variance, that collectively represented a quiet diversion of approximately $400,000 into a holding structure that did not appear in the syndicate's formal account architecture. Morton pointed to the line in the summary sheet. He said the money had not left the organization entirely. It had been transferred into a parallel structure, still accessible, still technically within the syndicate's financial footprint, but separated from the main accounts in a way that would allow it to be moved rapidly if circumstances required. He said this was consistent with someone preparing for a transition of control, establishing a financial reserve that would survive the kind of organizational disruption that a leadership change created. Carmine looked at the numbers for a long time. $400,000 was not a fortune, but it was a war chest. In their world, $400,000 in clean, accessible capital was enough to run an independent operation for 6 months, to pay the kind of people you needed to pay when you were taking something from someone who did not want to give it. He told Morton to document the findings formally and to lock the documentation in the secondary safe in Morton's own office, not in the compound. He told Morton to tell no one. Morton asked no questions. He packaged the documents with the methodical care of someone who understood that his own survival was contingent on Carmine's. That evening, Carmine walked the compound perimeter alone. This was unusual enough that Sal noticed from the window and came to the door. Carmine waved him back inside. He walked the stone wall in the dark, listening to the noise the trees made in the October wind, thinking about the architecture of the problem. He had a traitor in his inner circle. He had evidence of financial preparation for a coup. He had a dead bodyguard and a dead poisoning attempt, and a nurse in his guest room, and a son recovering in his medical ward. He had 3 of the 5 families who were likely receiving overtures from whoever was moving against him. He had an organization of several hundred people, most of whom had no knowledge of any of this, and who went about their daily business based on the assumption that the structure above them was stable. The question was not whether to act. The question was how to act in a way that contained the damage and neutralized the threat without triggering a wider reaction. Moving against Dante openly, without sufficient external support, risked a fracture. The 5 families' reaction to a public internal conflict in Boston would not be sympathy, it would be opportunism. If the structure looked weak, they would not prop it up. They would consume it. He needed to move surgically. He needed Dante isolated before Dante completed whatever timeline he was working toward. And he needed to do it in a way that preserved the organization's appearance of stability long enough to prevent the external families from making opportunistic plays. He also needed to make sure Leo and Clara were not in this building when it happened. He went back inside and told Sal he wanted to meet privately in the morning before anyone else was up. Sal said he would be there. In Leo's room, Carmine sat on the chair beside the bed while his son slept. The monitors showed steady readings. The color in Leo's face was normal. His breathing was regular. He looked young, which he was, and unguarded in sleep in the way that people who have not spent decades conditioning themselves against it look unguarded. Carmine watched him for a while. He did not let himself think about Alina. He thought about what was necessary and in what order. Clara came in at some point to check the monitors. She did it quietly, noticing Carmine in the chair and moving around him without comment. She made a note in her log. When she turned to leave, Carmine said quietly that he owed her an explanation about why she was still here. Clara said she had worked out most of it on her own. He said she was perceptive. She said ER nurses who weren't perceptive didn't last long. He said that someone inside his organization had tried to kill his son and was likely going to try again, and that until he had contained the situation, her proximity to Leo made her a potential target for anyone who wanted to eliminate witnesses to the first attempt. She absorbed this. She asked if she was a prisoner. He said no. He said if she chose to leave tomorrow, he would arrange safe transport and she could go. But that if she left, he could not guarantee her safety, because whoever was moving against him would likely view her as a loose end. She said that was a convenient argument for keeping her here. He said it was also accurate. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said she would stay until Leo was mobile. After that, she expected to go home. He said that was fair. She left the room. The next 2 days were quiet on the surface. Carmine met with Sal in the mornings and began a quiet process of repositioning the compound's security in ways that reduced Dante's information flow without making that reduction obvious. He moved 2 of Sal's men into positions that had previously been staffed by personnel more directly tied to Dante's network. He changed the secondary communication protocols, citing a routine security review. He had Sal conduct informal interviews with the compound's perimeter staff under the pretext of a performance evaluation, using the conversations to identify which men had had recent unsolicited contact with Dante's office. 3 men came back as flagged, not definitively compromised, but they had each received calls from Dante's direct line in the past 10 days, calls that fell outside the normal operational reporting structure. Carmine had them reassigned to perimeter positions on the east side of the property, away from the main house, in a way that was explained through the same routine review framework. On the 3rd day, Clara found something in Leo's IV line. She had been monitoring his IV bag through the standard replacement cycle. The bag she found had been delivered through the compound's medical supply system. The same system that had been vetted and managed by Dante's logistics coordinator as part of the security arrangement for Leo's post-hospital care. The bag looked correct. The label was correct. The seal appeared intact. But Clara had developed a specific professional sensitivity to IV bag presentation after a contamination incident she had managed at Boston General 3 years prior, and something about the bag's physical integrity did not sit right with her. The seal had a slightly different texture at the puncture point, consistent with a micro-injection having been made and then re-sealed using a technique that would pass casual inspection but not careful physical examination. She pulled the line without installing the new bag. She called for Carmine immediately. She told him what she had found in a very direct, brief explanation. She held the bag carefully by the edge and gave him the specific observation about the seal. She said she could not confirm it was compromised without testing, but that the risk of using it was not a risk she was willing to take with a patient in recovery. Carmine took the bag from her, holding it by the same edge. He looked at it. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said her name and asked if she was certain about the seal. She said she was not certain about contamination. She was certain about the physical anomaly. He called Sal into the room. He showed Sal the bag. Sal looked at it. Sal asked where it had come from. Carmine said it had come from the supply system. Then he said that whoever had gotten to the supply system had done it in the past 18 hours, which meant they were working with information about Leo's medical status and supply schedule that was current. Sal started to say something. Carmine raised one hand, stopping him. He handed the bag to Sal and told him to have it tested by the forensic consultant immediately, off-site. Then, from outside the compound walls, they heard the first vehicle. It was not traffic. The compound was set far enough back from the access road that vehicle noise from the road was barely audible at the house. What they were hearing was closer, and it came from multiple directions. The low mechanical assertion of heavy vehicles moving without headlights through the tree line on the north side of the property. Sal was already on his radio. Reports came back in clipped bursts. Multiple vehicles on the north perimeter. Movement detected on the south camera. The guard at the east gate was not responding. Carmine looked at Clara and told her to stay in Leo's room and to lock the door and not open it for anyone except him or Sal personally. She looked at him with an expression that was frightened but controlled and said she understood. He went to the bedroom closet, removed a shotgun from the locked cabinet behind his hanging clothes, loaded it, and went into the hallway. The assault was coordinated and professional. Dante had used men who were not drawn from the Boston Syndicate's regular roster, a deliberate choice to avoid Carmine having any prior intelligence about the personnel involved. They were tactical contractors, the kind of men who operated in the gray market between private security and organized violence. They moved in teams, with clear assignment of entry points and a command structure that reflected planning rather than improvisation. Carmine's loyal guards on the perimeter fought back. Some of them held their positions longer than was tactically reasonable, which was a function of loyalty rather than judgment. This bought time. Carmine used the time to move through the house with Sal toward Leo's room, taking the internal road that used the house's older section, which Dante's men did not know as well because Carmine had never invited Dante into the historical portion of the house. The fighting in the house was close and terrible and brief. Carmine shot 2 men in the upstairs corridor. Sal shot one at the top of the main stairs. The noise was contained by the thick stone of the old walls, which made it worse in some ways rather than better. All of it compressed into a space that was also full of furniture and family photographs and the objects of the ordinary life Carmine had constructed as insulation against the one he actually led. He reached Leo's room. He knocked and said his name. Clara opened the door. Leo was already standing, pale but upright, holding the IV stand like a cane. Carmine told Leo to put the stand down and come with him. He looked at Clara and told her the same thing. They went through the back of Leo's room into a connecting passage that ran behind the upper floor's bedrooms. At the end of the passage was a door that opened into a utility stair, and at the bottom of the utility stair was a door that connected to a sub-level storage area, and behind the far wall of the storage area, behind a set of shelving units that had not been moved in years, was the entrance to the tunnel. The tunnel was 40 meters long, and it ran under the north field to a converted outbuilding that had once been a carriage house and now served as a vehicle maintenance facility. Carmine had built it into the compound's original construction planning at a cost that had seemed extravagant at the time and now seemed obviously necessary. Leo moved through the tunnel slowly, still not fully recovered, one hand against the wall. Clara moved behind him, one hand on his shoulder, guiding. Carmine went first with the shotgun. Sal came last. Behind them, through the stone ceiling of the tunnel, they could hear the sound of the house being consumed. Not just the fighting, the structure of it. Glass and impact and the heavy mechanical sounds of organized violence completing its task. At the carriage house, Carmine found the vehicle he had positioned there 6 months ago. As part of the same contingency planning, he applied to all critical scenarios. It was a plain maintenance van, white, registered to a landscaping company that was one layer removed from any name in his financial network. It had a full tank. He started it, and they drove out through the carriage house's rear access, which opened onto a farm road that ran along the back of the property. As he turned onto the main road, he could see the compound's upper windows lit from inside. Not from electricity. He drove toward the city. Leo was in the back of the van with Clara. He asked what was happening. Clara told him to save his energy. Carmine drove and watched the mirrors and did not speak for a long time. When they were 20 minutes out from the compound, Sal, in the passenger seat, said that Dante's people had taken the property and that the men they had left behind at the perimeter were either dead or scattered. He said that simultaneous hits had been confirmed at 3 other locations: the port office on Pier 14, the construction company headquarters in Alston, and the parking authority management office in South Boston. All 3 had been hit within the same 2-hour window. Carmine's capos at those locations had been killed or had gone dark. Sal said Dante was moving fast. Carmine said that was what it looked like. He drove. The city came up on the right, lit and indifferent. He took a route through East Boston that avoided main roads and arrived at a location he had used years ago as a secondary fallback, a leased storage facility at a working shipyard in South Boston, the kind of industrial facility that was visible and ordinary from the outside and gave nothing away about what, if anything, it contained. He had stocked it quietly over the past year. Cash in 3 separate caches in a fireproof container. A change of clothes for himself and for Leo. Medical supplies. A prepaid phone. 3 different sets of identification documents for both himself and his son, all of them built on legitimate, but inactive social security numbers that he had obtained through a contact who worked in document authentication for the federal contracting sector. The documents were good enough for domestic movement and borderline adequate for international travel. He had told no one about this location. Not Sal. Not Morton. Not anyone. He parked the van inside the storage unit and closed the metal door. The space was cold. There was a portable space heater in the corner and he turned it on. Clara got Leo situated on a folding cot and went through the medical supplies, taking inventory without comment. Sal stood near the door and held his phone, cycling through calls that were not being answered. Carmine sat on a crate and looked at the concrete floor and thought. The next morning was when the full weight of the city's reaction arrived. Dante had moved quickly and comprehensively. By morning, a bounty had been placed through the informal distribution networks that connected the street-level operations to the syndicate's upper structure. $2 million for confirmed location of Carmine Moretti. The bounty had been communicated through 3 separate channels, ensuring that every independent operator, every corrupt beat officer, every informant and fixer and debt collector in Boston would have heard it by midday. 2 million was a serious number. It would put eyes on every public space in the city. It would turn casual observation into motivated tracking. It would make every person in Boston who had a financial reason to cooperate with the city's criminal networks into a potential scout. This was not a careless move. It was the correct move, tactically, for someone in Dante's position. You did not need to find Carmine yourself. You needed to ensure that the city found him for you. Carmine understood this. He also understood that the storage unit's advantage was its ordinariness. It was not a location associated with him by anyone who knew his name. But ordinariness had a limited protective window. The longer they stayed, the more variables they could not control accumulated around them. On the second day in the storage unit, Clara and Carmine were both awake while Leo slept. She had washed a small cut on Carmine's left forearm that he had not mentioned from the tunnel, where he had caught the edge of a support bracket. She cleaned it and bandaged it with the same matter, of fact efficiency she applied to everything. Then she said something to him that he did not expect. She said that she had spent the past 4 days watching him operate, watching how he managed the people around him and the information he received, and that she had noticed something that she thought he should hear, even if he did not want to. He said, "Go ahead." She said that everything he had built, the compound, the security, the procedures, all of it, had been designed to prevent exactly what had happened anyway, and that the reason it had failed was not because the procedures were inadequate. It was because the people inside the procedures had their own interests that his structures could not contain. She said this not as a critique. She said it as an observation, the kind a person makes when they have been watching a system for long enough to understand where it breaks. He said that was correct. She asked him what he was going to do about it. He said he was going to end it. She asked him if that meant retaking the operation or destroying it. He did not answer immediately. He thought about it in a way that was genuine, which was unusual for him. Most decisions he had made in his adult life had been made with the answer already formed and the thinking being about method rather than direction. This one was different. The honest answer was that he had been asking himself the same question since they had driven away from the compound. The organization he had built over 22 years was not just a financial structure. It was a form of certainty, a way of organizing the world that made him the fixed point around which everything else rotated. He had built it partly from ambition, partly from the specific competencies he had developed over a lifetime, and partly from the grief of losing Elena and the particular Heir pathology that had produced in him. The conviction that if he controlled enough variables, nothing essential could be taken from him again. That conviction had been comprehensively disproved. He told Clara that he was going to destroy it. She said nothing for a moment. Then she said she hoped he meant that. He said he was not in the habit of saying things he did not mean. She said she believed that. But that in her experience, people who had spent decades building something, even something destructive, found it much harder to walk away from than they expected when the moment arrived. She was not challenging him. She was preparing him. He told her she was probably right, and that he would manage that problem when he reached it. On the third day, Sal received a communication through a channel that Carmine considered compromised, but that Sal had left open deliberately in order to receive exactly this kind of information. The communication was from a man named Tully, a mid-level fixer who worked the intersection between the syndicate's operations and the city's political and law enforcement contacts. Tully was not loyal to anyone in particular. He was professionally loyal to whoever was paying him, and professionally useful to whoever needed information about the other party. Tully communicated that Dante had consolidated control of the port operations. All 3 of the capos who had survived the initial assault were now operating under Dante's direction. The financial accounts had been restructured. The 5 families had extended recognition to Dante's authority over Boston, pending a formal meeting that was scheduled for the following week. The federal law enforcement attention that had periodically circled the organization was now being managed through Dante's contact network rather than Carmine's, suggesting that the political relationships had transferred with remarkable speed. Tully also communicated, as a separate item, that Dante's people believed Carmine was no longer in the city. They had traced the van to a highway camera on Route 93 North, which was a deliberate misdirection Carmine had arranged on the first night by having Sal drive the van onto 93 and abandon it at a service plaza in Woburn. The heat map of the search was therefore concentrated north of the city. Carmine was in South Boston. He told Sal to pay Tully his fee and close the channel. Then he told Sal to arrange a specific piece of reconnaissance. He needed the current floor plan of Dante's primary headquarters. Dante had been operating his organizational functions from a nightclub he owned on the edge of the Seaport District, a large venue called Saltern that had opened 2 years ago, and that Carmine had always considered an overly conspicuous operational choice. The club occupied the ground floor and basement of a converted warehouse, with private offices on the second floor and a server room in the sub-basement that housed the syndicate's communication and financial records infrastructure. Carmine had been in the building 4 times. He knew the main floor's layout, the bar arrangement, the positions of the emergency exits, and the location of the main staircase. He did not know the current security configuration, which would have been upgraded after the takeover, and he did not know the positioning of the server room, which was a later addition to the building's use that had not been in place during his prior visits. He needed both. He also needed to think carefully about who else was in that building at any given time and what the collateral implications of his approach would be. He was not going to conduct an operation that put uninvolved people at risk. This was not a moral position for the sake of argument. It was a practical constraint that also happened to align with his genuine intentions. The club was open to the public 3 nights a week. He needed to move on a closed night. Sal sourced the reconnaissance through a contact in the city's fire and inspection office who had been on the syndicate's peripheral payroll for years and whose connection to the organization was not known to Dante's people because it had been managed exclusively through Carmine's side of the structure. The contact provided the building's most recent fire inspection report, which included a floor plan with current room designations. He also provided, through a separate channel, information about the building's security upgrade from a contractor who had done electrical work there recently and who was cooperative for reasons of money rather than loyalty. It took 2 days to compile. During those 2 days, Carmine also had Sal make contact with Morton Hale. Morton was a careful man who had survived in this industry for 14 years by being useful to whoever held power, and by ensuring that his usefulness was structural rather than optional. He had cooperated with Carmine's instruction to lock the financial documentation of Dante's diversion in the secondary safe. He was now, presumably, cooperating with Dante's organizational transition. This was not a betrayal in any meaningful sense. Morton was not a soldier. He was an accountant. You did not expect an accountant to die on a hill. But Morton had the documentation, and the documentation was necessary. Carmine called Morton on a prepaid number that Morton did not recognize. When Morton answered, Carmine said only that the envelope in the secondary safe needed to be transferred to a different location, gave Morton an address of a coin laundry in Roxbury, and told him the handoff needed to happen within 48 hours. He said Morton would be compensated for the cooperation. He said Morton would also be in a position of significant personal risk if the documentation fell into Dante's hands, which Morton would understand meant that Morton's own conduct over the prior months would be visible to Dante in ways that Morton might prefer to keep invisible. This was not quite a threat. It was an accurate description of interests. Morton, who understood the geometry of situations like this with professional clarity, agreed to the handoff without negotiation. The envelope arrived at the laundry within 36 hours, delivered by a courier who did not know what he was carrying. Sal collected it. The documentation inside was complete and formally organized, exactly as Morton had prepared it. Leo was improving steadily. By the 4th day in the storage unit, he was moving around without assistance and his cognitive function had returned fully. He was not, however, calm. He had absorbed the situation by degrees over the preceding days, filling in the gaps through what he overheard and what Sal told him on Carmine's direction. He understood now that Dante had taken the organization. He understood that his father was planning something. He did not understand what, and the not understanding was difficult for him. On the afternoon of the 4th day, Leo asked his father, with the directness that Carmine had always found both admirable and problematic in him, what the plan was. Carmine told him, not everything, but enough. He told Leo that he was going to remove Dante as a threat permanently, and that in doing so he was going to destroy the syndicate's operational infrastructure in a way that would prevent anyone from immediately reconstituting it. He told Leo that after this was done, Leo was going to leave the country with legitimate documents and establish a life somewhere clean, and that Carmine was going to follow. Leo asked if Carmine was serious about leaving. Carmine said yes. Leo looked at him for a long time. He said he did not know if he believed him, not because he thought Carmine was lying, but because he did not think Carmine was capable of leaving. He said the organization was the only thing his father had committed to fully in his entire life, with the possible exception of Leo himself. Carmine said that was not wrong. Leo asked if the nurse was coming with them. Carmine said no, that Clara had her own life, that her debts would be settled, and she would be returned to it intact. Leo said he thought Clara would be good for Carmine. He said it with the casual certainty of a young man making an obvious observation. Carmine told his son to rest. Clara was nearby, going through the medical supplies and taking stock of what she had used and what remained. She had caught enough of the conversation to understand the basic shape of it, though she had not interrupted. When Leo lay back down, she came to stand near Carmine and said, quietly, that whatever he was planning, she hoped it was not something that ended with him dead. He said he would try to avoid that outcome. She said she was serious. He said he was also serious. She looked at him with an expression he could not fully read, and then went back to the medical kit. 3 days later, at 11 in the evening, Carmine drove alone toward the seaport. The nightclub was closed on Mondays. Dante's organizational meetings had a pattern, documented through the reconnaissance, of occurring in the early part of the week, when the venue was quiet. On Monday evenings, the building's active security presence was concentrated on the second-floor offices and the sub-basement server room. The ground floor was staffed by a rotating pair of guards. The building's external perimeter had 2 fixed points and 1 mobile patrol that completed a full circuit in approximately 9 minutes. Carmine was dressed in dark, functional clothing. He was carrying the shotgun, a compact semi-automatic from the storage unit's cache, and 2 items he had specifically sourced over the preceding week through channels that Sal had managed with appropriate discretion: a thermite charge, compact and reliable, designed for industrial demilitarization applications, and a standard electromagnetic pulse device of the kind used in certain law enforcement evidence collection scenarios to neutralize digital storage. The pulse device was targeted, not wide range. It would affect a radius of approximately 3 meters, sufficient for a server room of the size indicated in the floor plan. He left the van 2 blocks north of the club and approached on foot through a pedestrian passage that ran between 2 adjacent warehouse conversions. The passage was dark and not covered by the club's external camera arrangement, which Sal's contact had confirmed was oriented toward the street approaches, rather than the alleys. He reached the building's eastern wall and stood for a moment in the shadow of a loading dock canopy. He could hear faintly music from somewhere inside, which meant there were people in the building other than Dante's team. This gave him pause. He stood there and listened, assessing. The music was coming from the basement, not the ground floor or the upper level. A private event of some kind, small, using the club's lower lounge space that could be rented independently of the main venue. He had not known about this. It was a variable that changed his approach, but did not change his target. He adjusted. The basement was not where he was going. He was going to the second floor and the sub-basement server room, which was a separate lower level from the lounge, accessible only from a dedicated stairwell off the main floor. He would not be going anywhere near the private event. But it meant the building had more civilians than anticipated, and it meant his margin for containing the operation was narrower. He entered the building through a side emergency exit that Sal's contact had confirmed was on a separate alarm circuit from the main system, and that could be opened from the outside with the correct key override, which the fire inspection contact had provided. He moved into the building's east corridor, which ran parallel to the main floor without entering it, and found the service stairway. He went up. The second floor corridor was wide and carpeted, with a row of closed office doors on the north side and windows looking onto the main floor's upper gallery on the south. A security camera covered the corridor's midpoint. He came in below the camera's field of view, using the angle he had identified from the building's electrical schematic, and reached the first office door. Inside were 2 of Dante's men. A conversation interrupted, both of them moving to stand before they fully registered what was happening. Carmine moved efficiently and without ceremony. He did not want witnesses, and he did not want bodies if he could manage it. And he managed it in this case without gunfire, which was a matter of proximity and speed, and the particular advantage that came from being someone who had spent 55 years doing the most physical things in difficult conditions, while the people in front of him had spent the last 3 weeks believing the threat had gone north on Route 93. He secured both men and moved to the next door. The process was methodical and took 40 minutes. He worked through the corridor from east to west, managing each office in sequence, aware of the building sounds below him, adjusting his pace to the rhythms of voices and movement coming up from the ground floor, where the remaining security was stationed. He did not encounter Dante in any of the first 3 offices. He found Dante in the corner office at the corridor's western end, the largest space on the floor, which looked out across the harbor through a wide industrial window. Dante was alone. He was at his desk. working through a stack of documents with the focused efficiency of someone who had recently inherited a significant administrative burden and was managing it conscientiously. There was a glass of whiskey at his elbow. He looked up when the door opened and had approximately 2 seconds in which the situation resolved itself clearly in his mind before Carmine was across the room. What followed was not a conversation in any meaningful sense. It was brief and it was physical and it was definitive. Dante was 40, and fit, and not without experience in physical conflict. Carmine was 55 and had been running on 4 hours of sleep and adrenaline for the better part of a week. The outcome was not predetermined. It took longer than Carmine expected, and it cost him more than he had planned, specifically a fractured rib from a desk corner that he had not fully controlled, and a cut above his left eyebrow from Dante's ring during a strike that landed in a way neither of them anticipated. Dante was alive at the end of it. Though not in any condition to continue the conversation he had apparently wanted to have in the last moments, which had involved a sequence of justifications about the inevitability of succession and the organizational logic of transition that Carmine had no interest in and no time for. He left Dante restrained in the office and went downstairs. The ground floor security responded to his descent from the stairway the way that prepared men respond to threats that arrive from an unexpected direction, fast but slightly misaligned, moving toward the wrong part of the stairway's exit, based on a reasonable assumption about the trajectory of someone coming down. This gave Carmine the brief window he needed. He took both men out of the situation in under 90 seconds. He did not kill them. He did not know who they were specifically, and whether their cooperation with Dante had been a matter of coercion or choice. And in the absence of that information, he defaulted to the minimal necessary force, which left both men in positions from which they would recover completely. He found the basement server room through the dedicated stairwell off the main floor's back section. The room was small and climate-controlled and filled with the quiet hum of equipment that represented, in aggregate, the full record of the Boston Syndicate's 22 years of operation. Financial records, communication logs, organizational documentation, account architectures, client relationships, political connections, payment histories, blackmail material, operational security protocols. All of it. Everything Carmine had built. He placed the EMP device in the center of the room against the primary server rack. He set the thermite charge against the tape backup array on the far wall. He gave himself 4 minutes. He went back upstairs and through the east corridor to the emergency exit and out into the night. When the thermite went, it was visible from 2 blocks away as a sharp, brief light through the building's lower vents. The EMP had preceded it by 30 seconds. He was back at the van when he heard the first alarm, a building fire system triggered by the thermite's heat signature. He started the van and drove north. The fire department's response time to the seaport was under 6 minutes. By the time the first truck arrived, the server room's contents were comprehensively destroyed, and the fire was contained to the basement by the building's suppression system, which was good equipment that did exactly what it was designed to do and prevented the fire from reaching the basement lounge, where the private event was still in progress. The people in the lounge were evacuated without injury, confused and shaken but unharmed. Dante was found by the first responders in the second floor office, restrained, with multiple injuries consistent with assault, alive and conscious and refusing to speak to police about the circumstances. The officers who handled the initial response noted this refusal with the professional unsurprise of people who dealt with the city's organized crime adjacent population regularly and understood that certain categories of injured person did not cooperate with law enforcement regardless of what had happened to them. Carmine drove back to South Boston with his fractured rib and his cut eyebrow and the quiet knowledge that the primary objectives had been achieved. He parked in the storage facility and sat in the van for a few minutes before he went inside. The pain from the rib was consistent and functional, the kind of pain you could work with, and he applied the same approach to it that he applied to most discomfort, noting it, categorizing it, setting it in the appropriate compartment of his attention. Inside, Clara was awake. She looked at the cut on his forehead and the way he was holding himself, and said he needed to sit down. He sat down. She cleaned the cut with the same professional directness she applied to everything and told him she needed to assess the rib. He told her it was fractured. He could feel the specific quality of the pain. She said she was going to confirm that herself, and he needed to take off his jacket. He took off his jacket. She ran her hands along his rib cage with the careful, systematic pressure of someone doing this properly rather than casually. She confirmed 2 fractured ribs, not 1. She said he needed wrapping and rest, and that neither was fully available to him in his current circumstances, and that she wanted to be clear that she was documenting his refusal to seek appropriate medical care. He said he appreciated that. She wrapped the ribs with what she had available. Leo, awake now, sat across the space and watched. He looked at his father with an expression that was complicated. Relief and grief, and something that might have been respect in a form that had not yet finished resolving itself. Carmine looked at his son and said that it was done. Leo asked about Dante. Carmine said Dante was alive, and in police custody, and would spend the remainder of the conversation with law enforcement, explaining the circumstances of the evening, which would be a long and ultimately self-destructive conversation given that the evidence that Dante would most want to suppress was now recorded in the documentation that Morton had transferred to the laundry, which Carmine had already arranged to be delivered to the Organized Crime Division of the Boston Field Office of the FBI through a channel that would not be traceable to him. The documentation did not just cover Dante's diversion, it covered, comprehensively, the financial architecture of the Boston syndicate across 14 years. It covered the political relationships, the law enforcement payments, the construction fraud arrangements, the port diversion operations, the chemical import routes. It was, essentially, a complete organized crime case study, assembled by Morton Hale over 14 years, with the meticulous precision of a man who kept thorough records, because thorough records were the foundation of his professional value. Carmine had read through it once, completely, before having it delivered. He had not felt proud of what he read. He had not felt ashamed in the way that people who have not built something feel shame when they see it described plainly. He had felt the specific, complicated emotion of a person looking clearly at the full scope of what they have done after a long period of looking at it only partially. It was not comfortable. It was honest. The FBI would act. They would act slowly at first because large organized crime cases required build-up and verification, and the documentation would need to be authenticated and cross-referenced against existing intelligence. But they would act. The Five Families' extension of recognition to Dante's authority would be irrelevant within 3 months once the federal investigation's scope became apparent. The financial infrastructure that sustained the Boston syndicate's operations would be frozen, seized, and dismantled. The political connections would become liabilities. The lawyers would stop returning calls. The accountants would develop sudden commitments to transparency. The organization that had taken 22 years to build would be consumed by the federal apparatus with the patient thoroughness that law enforcement applied to cases where they had complete documentation. This was not justice in any transcendent sense. It was process. But it was a process that produced a real and permanent outcome, which was what mattered. Carmine told Leo and Clara that they needed to move within 48 hours. The next 2 days were operational. Sal, whose own position in the aftermath needed to be resolved in a way that was both fair and realistic, was given a significant amount of cash from the storage unit's secondary cache and 3 separate pieces of identification, and was told, clearly and completely, that Carmine intended to disappear and that Sal's own best option was to do the same. Sal, who was not a man who expressed emotion visibly, sat with this information for a moment, and then said he understood. He said he was going to go to his sisters in Vermont and wait out the federal response, and then figure out what the next stage of his life looked like. Carmine said that sounded reasonable. They shook hands. Morton Hale, whose cooperation with the documentation transfer had been secured through a combination of financial incentive and accurate description of his own exposure, was in a complicated position. The documentation he had provided to the FBI included records that documented his own conduct, which made him simultaneously a cooperating source and a potential defendant. Carmine had communicated through an attorney, not his own, that Morton's cooperation would likely be viewed favorably in the government's charging decisions, and that Morton should retain independent legal counsel immediately. This was accurate advice delivered without sentiment. Morton was a capable man who would navigate the situation with the same methodical competence he had applied to everything else. Carmine did not feel responsible for Morton's choices over 14 years. he also did not abandon him entirely. The three capos who had survived the takeover and were now operating under Dante's direction were, in the aggregate, going to be consumed by the federal investigation along with the rest of the organization's operational structure. Carmine did not have a clean path to warn them or extract them. Two of them were men who had made choices throughout their careers that made their current situation a predictable outcome. The third, a man named Vitello, who had been running the construction union arrangements, and who had come into the organization under conditions of limited choice, rather than genuine ambition, was a harder case. Carmine sent him an anonymous message through a route that could not be traced, telling him simply that the federal investigation was coming, and that he had a short window to make decisions about his own cooperation with law enforcement. What Vitello did with that information was his own business. On the second of the 2 days, Carmine sat alone in the storage unit for an hour in the middle of the afternoon. Sal was gone. Clara was with Leo, reviewing the travel arrangements. The space was quiet except for the industrial sounds of the working shipyard beyond the facility's walls, cranes and machinery, and the deep percussion of container movement. The same sounds that had been the background of the most consequential years of his life. He thought about Elena. He did this deliberately, which was unusual. He normally kept her memory at a controlled distance, visiting it on the occasional terms he had established with himself over 2 decades, which limited the exposure because the exposure was painful in ways he had never fully processed. He had built the empire partly because of her loss. He was dismantling it partly because of her loss. There was a shape to this that he recognized without being able to fully articulate it. What he had done in her name had not honored her. She had been a woman who believed that a life well lived was measured by ordinary human connection, that the accumulation of power for its own sake was a form of poverty, that the protection of family did not require the control of everyone around it. She had told him these things while she was alive. He had listened with the attention of a man who agreed in principle, while building something that contradicted the principle in practice. He had spent 20 years telling himself that the empire was for Leo, for protection, for certainty. He understood now, in the quiet of the storage unit, that it had also been for himself, for the sense that he was in control of the variables that had allowed her to die. It had not protected Leo. It had nearly killed Leo. He sat with this for the full hour. He did not resolve it. He did not expect to. Some things did not resolve. They simply had to be lived within the honest awareness of what they were. Then he stood up and went to find his son. The travel documents held at the border. They left from Logan on a direct flight to Mexico City, 3 separate bookings and 3 separate names, staggered by an hour to avoid the appearance of a traveling group. Carmine had a layover, and then a connecting flight to a secondary city on the Pacific coast, a small city with an international community and a property market that absorbed people with cash who did not require explanation. Clara traveled in the opposite direction. Her flight was to San Francisco. Carmine had arranged, through a financial channel that would not resolve back to him, for the full amount of her outstanding debts to be paid from a law firm's client trust account, which would attribute the source to an anonymous settlement related to a hospital procedure incident, a category of payment that triggered no unusual scrutiny. She would receive a letter in the mail within 2 weeks explaining that her debts had been satisfied. She would understand what it meant, and she would not be able to trace it, and in time she would stop trying. At the airport, before they passed through separate security lines, Clara and Carmine stood for a moment in the terminal's departure area. It was crowded in the way of airports, people in transit, anonymous and purposeful. No one looked at them specifically. Clara said she hoped he found something worth having on the other side of all this. He said he was working on that. She said Leo was a good person and deserved a father who was present rather than fortified. He said he intended to be that. She looked at him with the directness that had characterized every interaction they had had from the moment she shoved past his armed guards in the ballroom. She said she believed him, and then she picked up her bag and went toward her gate without looking back, with the same matter of fact-forward motion she brought to everything. He watched her go. Then he turned toward his own gate. 6 months passed. The federal investigation into the Boston organized crime network generated 12 indictments in its first wave, including Dante on charges of racketeering, conspiracy, assault, and financial fraud. The financial fraud case was built substantially on the documentation that had been delivered to the FBI field office in South Boston, which the Bureau had spent 3 months authenticating against existing intelligence before moving to the indictment stage. The authentication process confirmed the documentation's accuracy across every verifiable element, which gave it the evidentiary weight that ultimately drove the charging decisions. Dante did not cooperate with prosecutors. He retained a defense attorney with an established record in federal organized crime cases and pursued the litigation with the aggressive competence that characterized his general approach to problems. The case was not resolved quickly. It was not intended to be. The federal process moved at the speed of thoroughness rather than urgency. The five families' recognition of Dante's Boston authority dissolved within 60 days of the indictments. Political and organizational recognition in that world was contingent on the capacity to operate, and a defendant in a federal racketeering case lacked that capacity in the practical ways that mattered. The Providence family moved to extend its port access agreements directly, without going through a Boston intermediary. The other two families that had attended Dante's Commercial Street meeting reallocated their operational interests accordingly. The Boston Syndicate, as a cohesive organizational entity, ceased to function. The construction union operations, the parking authority arrangements, the commercial real estate fronts, all of it came under federal scrutiny in sequence as the investigation's investigators worked through the documentation's categories. The political connections that had sustained the syndicate's relationships with municipal, contracting, and regulatory bodies were severed as the relevant public officials developed the urgent need to distance themselves from names now attached to federal indictments. This was predictable. In Carmine's experience, political loyalty was always the first form of loyalty to dissolve under institutional pressure. Morton Hale cooperated fully with prosecutors under a formal agreement and received a deferred prosecution arrangement that required 30 months of cooperation and the payment of a civil penalty representing a portion of the fees he had received over 14 years. He retired from accounting. He moved to Florida. He was not a sympathetic figure to anyone involved in the investigation, but he was a useful one, which in the federal context produced a better outcome than many people in his position received. Sal was never charged. He spent 8 months in Vermont, living quietly, and then moved to a secondary city in the South where he had family connections he had not maintained for years. He worked in a cousin's landscaping operation. He did not contact Carmine. Vitello cooperated with the investigation as a confidential informant in exchange for a reduced charging arrangement. He provided information about the construction union operations that materially advanced 2 subsidiary investigations. He was relocated to a different city under a name change arrangement coordinated through the Federal Witness Protection Program. Whether he was at peace with the choices that had brought him to that outcome was not known. He was alive, which was more than some. Clara Voss was appointed as head nurse of an urgent care clinic in a private healthcare network in the Bay Area, a position that paid significantly more than her Boston General salary. Her debts, which had been her most persistent source of financial stress for years, were resolved. Her mother's care continued without interruption. She worked the same relentless hours she had always worked, driven by the same instinct she had always had, which was to do the most good that a given situation allowed and to move on to the next situation without ceremony. She did not think about Carmine Moretti constantly. Occasionally, she thought about the particular quality of his attention, the way he listened with complete focus when he considered something important, and she wondered whether he had found what he said he was working on. She thought he probably had, not because she was optimistic about people in general, but because she had assessed him as a person who completed the things he committed to. She was mostly right. In a coastal town on the Pacific side of Mexico, in a house that was modest by any standard and comfortable by the standard of a man who no longer required fortification, Carmine Moretti woke early and made coffee, and sat on the terrace where the light came through the trees before it reached the water. The town was small and international and quiet in the specific way of places that attract people who have decided, for various reasons, that the lives they were living before were no longer the lives they intended to live. No one in the town knew his history. No one asked. Leo was in the same town, in a separate house 2 streets away. He had enrolled in an online graduate program in finance, something he had proposed himself, and that Carmine had agreed to with the specific pleasure of watching his son want something ordinary and achievable. Leo's recovery from the neurotoxic exposure had been complete. He moved well. He slept without the particular alertness that had characterized his sleep in the compound, the Heir trigger wakefulness that Carmine had always noticed and always attributed to proximity to the organization. Leo had a dog. He had found it at a local shelter in the second month and brought it home and named it in Spanish, a name Carmine could not remember clearly because he was not good with the language and mixed it up regularly, which Leo found entertaining. The dog was large and cooperative and visited Carmine's terrace most mornings, arriving after Leo left for his walk on the beach road. On the morning that was approximately 6 months after their arrival, Carmine was sitting with the dog at his feet, looking at the water. The light was good. The town was waking up around him in the slow way of places that had not adopted the urgency of larger places. He was not at peace in any complete sense. He did not think he would be, not with the full accounting of what he had done and built and destroyed over 5 years sitting in permanent residence in the honest part of his mind. But he was present. He was in the specific day, he was in rather than in the project of managing variables to control future days. This was different from anything he had experienced since he was a young man before the Empire, before Elena's death, before the long accumulation of certainty and loss. He thought about Elena that morning for a while. He thought about who she had been and what she would have said about the series of decisions that had eventually produced this terrace and this dog, and this light. He did not think she would have approved of the path. He thought she might have approved of the destination, with reservations. She had been a woman with reservations about most things, offered clearly and without drama, which was a habit of mind he had come to miss with increasing specificity as the years accumulated. He sat with this thought until the dog stood up and moved toward the street to meet Leo, who was coming back up the road from the water with his shoes in his hand and his phone in his pocket, and the particular ease of a young man who was not, for the first time in his adult life, worried about what was moving toward him. Carmine watched his son come up the path. He raised his coffeed cup. Leo raised his hand back. The morning continued, ordinary and sufficient, which was what it was, and what it needed to be, and nothing more.